This is like the best panel of the day, the family panel. Okay. Okay. So, and this is kind of like a terrific thrill for me because, you know, I've been working on issues about the family and marriage and why is the family important to society and why do people think there's an important relationship between the state of the family and the state of the nation and so forth and so on. And throughout the 90s welfare debates and the last decade or so with all these other issues, and most recently, is there a class divide with marriage? Is marriage becoming a privilege of the haves versus the have-nots? What's happening across race and class lines with marriage, with the family, what have you? How does this all tie into the end of men issue? So I'm very happy to be able to wrap up the day with a panel delving into some of these issues about family, and certainly some of the really moving parts of Rosin's book have to do with gender dynamics within different types of relationships, different types of families, and so forth and so on. So I'm going to try to save most of our time for actual presentations and discussion and apologize to my panelists for keeping interest to a bare minimum because you do have their bios, but I'll just quickly tell you that June Carbone and Naomi Cahn are going to present some work that relates to a book they're doing called Family Classes. It follows up on their very influential book, Red Families versus Blue Families, kind of taking off on red states and blue states. June is at University of Missouri, Kansas City. Naomi's at George Washington. And then Rick Banks, who you already heard from this morning, is going to talk to us about, I'm not actually sure what he's going to talk about, but we'll find gender dynamics and race. He's going to talk about race in marriage. Okay, and he wrote Is Marriage for White People? He's got a new book in the works about, what's the title of it? Working title. He's got a new book in the works, okay, as well. And then we're going to hear from Kathy Edin, and Kathy Edin wrote a book that really was term setting in terms of low-income mothers' attitudes about marriage, called Promises I Can Keep. And she's got another book coming out early next year about low-income fathers called Doing the Best I Can, and she's sharing a chapter of that with us. And then Dan Hatcher, who's and Kathy's at Harvard, sorry, at the Kennedy School. Kennedy School, right? Okay. And then Dan Hatcher, who's at Baltimore, brings to us a great wealth of experience as a clinician, as a former government employee, as a legal aid attorney, dealing with low-income people, particularly some of the struggles that low-income fathers face. And I'm just going to wrap it all up with whatever time there is left. Okay. So without any further ado, we're going to have PowerPoint for the first presentation. Then we're going to turn it off, and people are going to come sit up at the table.
Okay, thank you. One of the great things about being last on the last panel of this first day is we've heard so many wonderful things already that I suppose the even better news is that June and I have already cut our presentation in half because other people have already covered some of the ground that, that we're planning to cover. We've been researching the changes in the family for more than a decade, actually more than a decade together, and probably much longer than that on our own. And so we want to start by just, celebrating the work that Hannah has done in this book in providing a rich ethnographic account of how men, women, and families have been affected by the changing American economic structure, by how families have been affected by plant closings, by the disappearance of lifetime employment for blue-collar men, by the disappearance of middle manager positions for men at an age when embarking on a new career is difficult, if not impossible. And so it's a richly drawn portrait bringing together family law issues and economic issues. So our admiration for the book is not in the least bit affected by the fact that we put these events into a slightly different framework. This incredibly rich portrait has already, others earlier in the day have asked similar questions. When Joan Williams started talking, I looked at June and said, yes, we agree. The question is the end of men about the rise of women, or, let's see, well, Or in our second slide, is it about, let's see, is it about the recreation of class? And here you can see how the rich are in fact getting richer. So we think that the rise of women is actually about the increase in economic inequality. And we think that there are all kinds of gender implications about that. The end of men doesn't mean the empowerment of women, because men still hold structural power in our society. While HannaRosin suggests that the end of men does mean some kind of a change in power, we don't think so, and again, I think Joan's statistics on just how long it would take to achieve parity among CEOs, et cetera, the one she talked about at lunch, show some of what's going on with respect to this issue of structural power. So the claims that we're making are about what this all means with respect to the family. And we're going to talk about this rise of the 1%, the rich getting richer, and how that has distorted the economics of our society. So we look at three different issues in the paper, and we'll have time probably to get through maybe half of them. But just how economic changes have come about with greater income inequality among men. We then talk about how the gender inequality among men has upped the stakes underlying the mating and dating games. Increased inequality segments marriage markets, writes off a high percentage of men as effectively unmarriageable, and creates gender mismatches. So we're going to talk a bit about what that all means. And then I think others on the panel will talk about this third point, is that while men have disappeared from relationships in lower income and working class families, they haven't disappeared within family law writ more largely, where more and more states have joint custody presumptions, where low-income men are on the hook for child support, et cetera. So in family law, men are quite visible and have not ended at all. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to June.
So as Naomi indicated, instead of giving you a lot of data, which we've been talking about all day, we're going to jump directly to our main thesis. Imagine society. Women own 40% of the property, have much more property rights in marriage than in surrounding societies, are known for their wit and outspokenness, are well-educated and independent, sexual mores are relatively free for the time and the area, same-sex relationships are accepted, and the society is? Now, no one, I want you to think Sparta, and I want you to think Rosie the Riveter, and I want to suggest no one would confuse either Sparta or Rosie the Riveter with the rise of women. And in asking why that might happen, our touchstone has been the work by Guten Tag and Secord, a book that came out in the 80s. The title was Too Many Women. It influenced Bill Wilson, and its thesis was something like this. In societies in which women have relatively little power, the sex ratio will tell you a lot about what relationships are like. So if the women outnumber the men, Guten Tag and Secord predict high divorce rates, greater acceptance of non-marital births, more single women, greater sexual freedom for men and women, greater gender distrust, but not necessarily power, either in society or within relationships. Here's the theory we are going to put out there, connecting what is happening in the country as a whole with what's happening in families. This is just two standard deviations. But if I were to give you the Gini coefficients on increase in inequality in wages in American society, it has increased more for men than for women. We deleted the slides that go into this in great detail, but you've heard the data all day. Women are increasing in the middle, but not at the extreme 1%. And if you were to map women on men, the one place where men continue to outnumber women substantially, at the top. What is happening at the bottom? More men at the bottom relative to women compared to a couple generations ago, but all the studies on the effect of inequality itself is that higher inequality societies also tend to produce increases in imprisonment, substance abuse and mental illness, violence and domestic violence, with the effect that where blue outnumbers red at the bottom, let's see if I can get a right here, you're writing off a high percentage of men as not good partners. And that means in the middle, there will be a lot more women than there are men. So we look at, and we take our translation of Gutenberg's Accord. What income inequality is doing to American society is it is segmenting marriage markets. If you look at the likelihood that college graduates will marry each other, it is way up, especially for those college graduates whose parents also graduated from college. You see greater assortative mating. I've already mentioned that when you look at the top group and you ask which women have seen their marriage rates increase, it is the top 5% of women in terms of income, the only group in society whose marriage rates have increased. That's because we're arguing this is the group where it's a high status, high stakes game, marriage in the 30s, but to the right person. You see that men also care about the income of their partners and do so at high levels as well as lower levels in society. We can forget about Donald Trump, but if we think of our students, some of you out there, you're going to live in Boston, you need 2 incomes. At the bottom, on the other hand, is a very different picture, but a picture where when you look at attractive men, they are outnumbered by attractive women, and we are talking about the word attractive to mean stable, reliable, good partners. So the predictions, and here are some data on what has happened to the family. Divorce rates. If you look at the beginning period in the graph, which is those people marrying in the early 70s, yes, marriage rates were going up, and yes, college graduates, the bottom dark line, were less likely to divorce than others, but the move is in the same direction. Starting with those marrying around 1980, the trends diverge. The divorce rate goes down for college graduates back to what it was in 1965, before no-fault divorce, before the pill, going up for everyone else. These are non-marital birth rates, and I want you to note a couple of things. For white college graduates, this is BA college graduates, there is effectively no difference. The non-marital birth rate remains at 2%, moving from the 80s to the years 2006, 2008. Goes up for everyone else. Rick Banks has written a wonderful book talking about the racial dynamic. Note the increase in non-marital births to African-American college graduates. Some of what is going on is a difference in gender ratios. Here's the one I like best. This is from Mark Regneris. What's the likelihood that a woman who has a boyfriend is still a virgin? Turns out there's a direct correlation with the percentage of women on college campuses. And he talks about it as the price of sex. This is a pretty strong correlation. What is the likelihood a woman can still be a virgin and have a boyfriend? But it also correlates to the same things you see in the fragile family studies. That is questions such as, do women trust men? Do they think the men in their lives are reliable? Are they happy with the relationship? Do they think the man is attentive? Well, both the fragile family studies that look at poor women who are typically unmarried, but in relationships, and women on college campuses who are an entirely different cohort in almost every respect, you find a correlation between levels of gender trust, satisfaction with relationships, and the gender ratios with the fragile family studies also teasing out the relationships between employment and the availability of men, as well as simply gender ratios in toto. What does this mean? Well, one of the things it means is there are now feedback loops into the next generation. This is simply the income effect. Note when you're looking at family income, how much the top group, college graduates, takes off, everybody else stagnates. And Robert Putnam and a variety of studies on engagement talk about this as affecting everything from how many minutes a day parents spend reading Goodnight Moon to their children or playing patty cake to the likelihood that a high school senior will be captain of a sports team. This also has feedback loops into family law, and when we look at what is happening to the family and the legal regulation of the family, we argue there is a new middle class ideal, and we think Hanna's book describes it quite well. For those for whom marriage works, you see sharing principles, you see seesaw marriages, trade-offs, who's taking care of the kids, who's working, depending on circumstances. You see interdependent finances, where the interdependence increasing over time. You see a legal preference for shared custody as the new norm, which gives more power to men at divorce. But to make this work, to make this new, relatively egalitarian, relatively interdependent ideal work, requires a high degree of gender flexibility, relative equality, and maturity. Gender flexibility, I think Rosin captures this beautifully in the book. But you also see one of the things that segments marriage markets is the college-educated middle class is getting married much later and having children much later, and the non-marital birth rate is close to non-existent, which means childbearing is deferred into the late 20s and 30s. Ask me about abortion if you want to know what that has to do with all of this. It, too, is a marker of class. Blue-collar relationships, in the meantime, and I want to emphasize this, what does family law have to say about the model of family relationships for more than half the country? Well, the old model for the top and the bottom used to be patriarchy. Women were socialized into deference. You should see the interviews with Jackie Kennedy about, men are supposed to defer to their husbands and not ask too many questions about what the men are doing on the side. But I like best the interviews with the intern in the Kennedy era who says about menage a trois, well, I was supposed to defer. I did what they told me to do. That's the old era. What's the new era? Again, Hanna captures beautifully Southern Baptists. The women are earning the money, they're taking care of the kids, and they are going to church where they learn to defer to their husbands. They maintain the fig leaf. But if we were serious about women having power in society, if we were serious about matriarchy, that bad word, it would mean something different from what we see. It would mean men socialized to defer to women. We aren't seeing that. And I would suggest that the combination of men who don't defer and women who are both primary wage earners and primary caretakers is that family law is a bad deal. Get married and you're splitting the savings she thinks of as for the kids. Rick did a wonderful job on all of this today. With custody, you're looking at something where the insistence on shared custody means something different with two people who are together in shared child rearing than it does from two people who could never manage to get along well enough to live together. It means something different from two people who squabble about money to two people who are arguing about being choked to the point of unconsciousness. I would suggest that the family law regime we think of as the feminist victory, built on equality, built on interdependence, built on sharing principles, is a bad deal for couples who can't make it work. What do women really want? We can come back to this. Our thesis has largely been, along with the Gutentag and Secord argument, that it is a mistake to see women's independence as an indication of equality, either in terms of societal power or in terms of family relationships. The Gutentag and Secord thesis is basically, if you see a gender mismatch, and we're arguing here, the gender mismatch is exacerbated by inequality, which is a result of societal policies, that you will see women's independence, that women in every era, in Sparta, in the Middle Ages, Rosie the Riveter, pick up the pieces when the men aren't there. But that's different from genuine equality or societal power. If women had more power, what would we want? Well, the answer I would give to the questions that came up with Joan Williams' discussion today is, what would happen if you capped corporate pay, brought back 90% marginal tax rates? You would change the incentive structure. Think not of Mitt Romney, but George Romney. George Romney's identity is with the health of General Motors. Mitt Romney identifies his success not with the long-term endurance of Bain Capital, but how much money he gets to keep after taxes. If you go back and you look at the dull, boring 50s, the gray flannel suit, the era of conformity, and much greater equality, at least equality based on class, based on economics, you also see greater investment in institutions rather than individuals, in large part because you can't take it with you. Final thought. If we think about how women at the margin, I am not saying women as essentialist others. There are lots of women who favor hierarchy. But if you were to say, what would it look like to have a society with a lot more societal power for women? Democrats would win in a landslide, favor government action, 45 to 36, more government assistance to the poor. Note that a majority of men also favor these things. And neither the majority of men nor women get what they want, which is greater equality. A final note, because I can't resist responding to Kingsley Brown. I think that much of what he said is accurate, but ask yourself this question. If you couldn't walk away from Wall Street with that six-figure bonus, or the CEO that now are up to how many numbers I can't count, if you capped corporate pay, would we care whether geeks want to be engineers instead of psychologists? I suggest that the issue of equality by itself is rewriting the nature of gender relationships and the family.
Next will be Professor Rick Banks. You're down there.
Okay. So, wow, it's hard to find. It's a tough act to follow there. That was a wonderful presentation. So, can everybody hear me? If you can't hear me, just raise your hand. You can, or you cannot?
Well, you need to use the mic for the
sit down
taping,
and
though,
use the
Rick.
mic, actually?
You have to use the mic.
Okay.
Sorry. It can be if it's empty.
So this is being recorded?
Yes.
Okay, we're good. So I wanted to talk about this is sort of something that's not in The End of Men, which was not surprising this was not in The End of Men, but I admit that it was a bit dismaying for me. And that's the absence of African Americans in the stories that HannaRosin tells. I mean, African Americans come up here and there, but it's not central to the story she tells. I think, and it's puzzling why it's not, because almost every claim or every issue that she addresses in the book is exemplified in the lives of African Americans. In fact, one might even say that many of the claims in the book are overstated or overdrawn with respect to whites, but not so with respect to African Americans. So there would actually be a better fit between substantive arguments and the evidence if African Americans had occupied a prominent place in the story. Let me just talk about a few, well, actually several other areas where we see the story of African Americans as emblematic of some of the changes she talks about. The gender gap in education. She makes a lot of the gender gap in education. Among whites, though, frankly, the gender gap is not that great. When you look at undergraduate education, you see a gap. When you look at professional schools, you don't see much of a gap, if any gap at all. You look at business schools, they're overwhelmingly male. You look at traditionally male majors, computer science, they're overwhelmingly male still. So we don't see this dramatic shift educationally when you look at whites, but when you look at African Americans, you do. The gender gap among African American undergraduates is 2 to 1. Literally 2 to 1. This year, twice as many black women as black men will graduate from college. Black women outnumber black men approaching 2 to 1, not there yet, but moving in that direction in medicine and in law. And even if you look at a traditionally male field like computer science, there are more black women who will receive computer science degrees this year than there are black men. These are exactly the changes that the End of Men is concerned with. Black women also translate that educational advantage into an earnings advantage. There is a gender gap when we look at all workers, and I'll be brief here, so I'll leave out some detail. There is a gender gap in favor of men among all groups when we look at all workers. The gender gap, though, among African Americans is smaller by far than among any other group. And in fact, because that number takes into account people who are working, if you take into account the differential employment rates between black men and women, it's unquestionably the case that black women are more economically accomplished, shall we say, than black men are. And this is a substantial factor in black life today. This labor force participation or the high labor force participation rates of black women are remarkable now. However you cut it, black women have much higher labor force participation rates than white women. This was true decades ago as well, right? White women entered the labor force in recent decades. Black women did it a couple decades earlier. So all of the trends that you see with white women working and with white women's income gains relative to men, we see those trends in much starker relief and in a much more extreme fashion when we look at African Americans. So then when we look at the consequences of these developments, we also see that they are starkest among African Americans. By some measures, marriage has declined throughout society. And again, this is a general picture. Marriage has declined throughout society. This development, though, has been greatest among African Americans. Black men and black women alike are more unlikely than any other group in society to be unmarried. We've also seen an increase in divorce rates among African Americans. African American marriages are more likely than not to end in divorce. Sobering statistic. Following from the marriage decline, we see that unwed childbearing has also increased dramatically among African Americans. When Moynihan wrote in 1965, he was startled that the rate of unwed childbearing among African Americans was approaching 25%. But now it's above 25% for whites, right? So it's moved in the same direction for everyone, but it's gotten a lot higher for African Americans. That is to say that if you want to understand the increase in unwed childbearing in society, you see that change most dramatically in the lives of African Americans. All these developments that I've just talked about, I've talked about them generally, but they're most apparent. The marriage decline and the unwed childbearing, they're most apparent among the white, poor, and the working class. Right? Among African Americans, again, 4 decades ago, they were very apparent among the white, poor, and the working class. Now they're actually apparent among the middle class as well. Right? College-educated black women are much more likely than their white peers to have a child without being married. And they're also more likely, as it turns out, this is an issue we haven't discussed, but the rates of childlessness have increased as well over the last many years, right? And this is often among very educated women who don't have children. Black women, let me be sure I get this right, black women with professional degrees, right, graduate degrees, are the most childless group of women in society. So the most educated black women are showing the same trend as among whites, right? With higher educated women who can support themselves are often deciding not to have children and to work. The black women do that more than any other group of women. So this is remarkable sort of parallel movement here. Finally, we also see trends throughout society apparent among African Americans when we think about the marriage delay Age at marriage has risen, which is part of this story as well. And that's part of why when we say marriage has declined, it means that there are more people who are unmarried. Part of being unmarried is that people are delaying marriage. And that's happened the most among African Americans, right? In 1950, African Americans married earlier than other groups, actually. The average age at marriage for African Americans was earlier, now it's later. African Americans marry on average at a later age than any other group, men and women alike. Right? So we've seen that delay of marriage most among African Americans, and that's a big issue. And even some evidence that hooking up, and here the evidence is a little more speculative, but there's even some evidence that hooking up may have appeared first and may be more common among African Americans than among other groups, but for the same reasons, right, that we see it among whites. So there are all these ways in which the African American experience is actually emblematic of a more universal American experience. Many of these changes, though, the marriage decline in particular and labor force participation, many of these changes are especially salient among the poor and the working class among whites, not in the same way among the middle class. But when the gender gap is great enough, the experience of African Americans tells us, these changes can ripple throughout the socioeconomic spectrum. So there are two ways that this happens. So black women have outpaced black men so substantially that a majority, and this was a striking, in the course of writing my book, I just encountered these are striking statistics. Excuse me. More than half of college-educated black women who are married to a less educated husband. So you think, half of college-educated black women who are married to a non-college educated man. Again, that's a trend, that's an inevitable consequence of women outpacing men educationally. Among African Americans, that gap is approximately 2 to 1. If we have any sticklers in the audience, I'll just say now that the college graduation gap is actually about 1.94 to 1, women to men, right? But we round that up to 2. Now, for whites, it's not there yet, not close to that yet. Right? But if whites move in the same direction as African Americans, we would also expect to see large numbers of white women marrying men who are much less educated and lower earning than they are. And this is not seesaw marriages. These are really marriages where, in many cases, there is an educational gap that translates into an economic gap given high levels of labor force participation, and that can result as well in what I think of as a cultural gap, that we have significant class differences within a marriage, which itself can create conflict because people have different ideas about how the marriage should operate. And that's one of the reasons I think that the African American divorce rate is so high, because we have so many couples who are mismatched, because you have many professional class women with many working class men, and they have different ideas about what this is they're getting into. So that's one consequence we could see if we'd made the African American story more central. Another consequence is to imagine that how the gap between men and women might actually depress marriage rates throughout the socioeconomic spectrum. That is, it might depress marriage rates at the high end of the socioeconomic spectrum as well. And this ties in with Naomi and June's paper. So here's the idea, and I'll try to be brief. Here's the idea, is that for men, typically, marriage is associated with socioeconomic status, with income, right? So if you look at a graph and look the likelihood of a man's being married, the likelihood of 30 to 34-year-old age men being married, and you plot that by income, it goes up like that. As men's income increases, their likelihood of being married increases. And that's generally true, except for African American men, we find that at every point, marriage rates are lower. And when you look at the highest earning African American men, say men who earn $100,000 a year, you find that they actually are less likely to be married than their lower earning but economically stable counterparts. Right? So black men who earn more than $100,000 a year, say 40 years old, are less likely to be married than black men who earn $70,000 a year, who are 40 years old. Part of the story for this, to tie in with the previous paper here relates to the gender imbalance. And there are two key points here. One is that the numbers of people in the market, as much as we may think about marriage is about love and so forth and so on, it's also about power and negotiation and trying to work the best deal you can. And that's what marriage is. That's what a relationship is. So there's a market. And what happens in this market is determined by the power that people have, and the power they have depends on the options they have outside of their relationship. Whichever group is in short supply has more options than the group that's not in short supply. So if you have few high-earning men and you have a lot more women, remember this 2-to-1 gap in college graduation, black men have a lot more power than black women in the marriage market. Black women have a lot more power than black men have a lot more power than black women in the marriage market. And at the margins, men probably are less inclined to marriage than women. Controversial statement, at the margins, not everyone, at the margins. And that results in there being fewer long-term committed relationships among higher earning African American men than among either their white counterparts or lower earning African American men. And that has all sorts of consequences, which if I had more time I would go into for the family. Let me just say though that these are sort of the black experience. What I want to show is that the black experience opens up a whole array of possibilities of what could really be ahead in the future. And that's what the End of Men is about. It's about the future and how society is changing. What is disheartening, and I don't want to say, because I think that, this is a wonderful, wonderful book in many ways, and I enjoyed reading it and value it and have talked to people about it. This is a more general claim about our society, which is that it's very, very difficult to talk about black people as an embodiment of, or as being emblematic of what may happen to white people. And I think part of the story, frankly, is that as a society, we do not imagine black people as, in a really central way, us. We don't imagine the black experience as being central to the American experience, and many white people cannot imagine understanding their lives through the lens or through the prism of the black experience. And I think that is a shame, because that's a loss, and it actually eclipses some of the very developments that we would do well to try to understand.
Thank you. And now, okay. And now in a perfect seamless web, we're going to go to Kathy Edin.
So in 2009, I was in the Starbucks in Lexington, Massachusetts, waiting to pick up my daughter from school. I got a call from a reporter. 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours later, I realized I hadn't done it. That reporter was HannaRosin. I've only had one conversation about my own work that was as riveting as that one, and that was with Jerry Brown, and he's pretty darn interesting. So thank you, Hannah, for that conversation and for stimulating this amazing event today. If you've taken anything from today's events, you know that there's a class divide in the family. 6% of college educated women will ever have a non-marital childbirth. 60% of high school dropouts will do so. Now, some of these are fragile families. They're together, they just don't happen to be married, but they are very fragile. Half will break up by the time the child turns 1, about 80% by the time that child turns 5. So this leads us to ask, what is the ongoing role of men in this part of the class divide in the family? Now, I'll admit to you, I know nothing about the three top quintiles of the American income distribution. I only know about the bottom 2/5, and the story I'm going to tell you today is really about the bottom 5th. I'm going to take you to the streets of America's poorest city, its second most dangerous city, just beat out by Flint, Michigan, Camden, New Jersey, and its sister city, Philadelphia, across the river, where we spent, my husband and I, and my co-author, along with an amazing research team, 7 years following 110 black and white men living in high poverty neighborhoods of over 20% poverty. Now, these men know they're marginal. Have they simply withdrawn from family life? Well, let's pause for a minute and think about how the way family used to work. I'm going to quote here from Frank Furstenberg and Andrew Cherlin's book in 1991, meant to illustrate and explain why so many men walked away from their families post-divorce, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They write, for many men, marriage and parenting are a package deal. Their ties to their children and their feelings of responsibility for their children depend on their ties to their wives. It is as if their men only know how to be fathers indirectly through the actions of their wives. If the marriage breaks up, indirect ties between fathers and children are also broken. Elliot Lebeau, the excellent ethnographer of black street life in the 60s, similarly wrote, the frequency of contact between father and child clearly depends more on the father's relationship with the mother than on the relationship with the child himself. Sorry about the gendered language. It is almost as if the men have no direct relationship with their children, independent of the relationship with the mother. What about now? What's happening on the streets of Camden and Philadelphia? I argue in this book that what men are doing in these neighborhoods is they are trying to recast the package deal. And what they're doing is attempting a radical redefinition of family life. In Furstenberg and Cherlin and LeBeau's work, it was the father-mother bond that was central, and the father-child bond that was peripheral. But here, men are envisioning the father-child bond as central and the mother-father bond as peripheral, as necessary, as nice, but not necessary. So in the wake of those breakups that so often happened, do disadvantaged men flee? Or do they make an end run, or attempt to make an end run around the moms to forge a direct bond with their child? Now, this central dynamic of the new package deal manifests itself in a million ways, and I only have time to talk about a few of these ways here. But I want to take you into the inner workings of the package deal by beginning from the beginning. In the neighborhoods that we studied in Camden, Philadelphia, courtships, if you can call them that, occur at lightning speed. There is little partner search involved. At least this is the father's story. The girl who becomes your child's mother, and again, I don't want you to read black here because blacks and whites were both telling this story, is the friend of a friend, the girlfriend of a friend that you stole, the girl down the street, or the woman you met on the job. And they're just the woman you happen to be with when conception occurs. The words talking, kicking it, associating, affiliating have taken the place of more familiar words from middle-class discourse of love and commitment. Then one thing leads to another, and a baby is on the way. Now, how does a young man greet the news he's about to become a father via an unplanned birth? Does he cut and run as conventional wisdom has told us he does? No. And in fact, 70% of the time, he responds with happiness, occasionally even downright joy. Thank you, Jesus, is what Andre Green told us about his reaction to the news he was going to become a father at 17 via a relationship that had broke up many months before. So what does happiness mean? When he hears the news, his whole life flashes before his eyes. And here's where context is key. Remember, these are young men growing up in the tattered inner urban cores of our cities, in family and neighborhood contexts that are immensely challenging. Try spending a day in Camden, New Jersey, and fraught with struggle. What these young men called this was negativity. The negativity was almost choking them. Meanwhile, a baby, a pure and innocent baby, was almost like a magic wand that could be used to vanquish that negativity and could offer redemption from an already troubled past. This was his chance. Now, LaCondia Catlett, an 8th grader in a Camden middle school at about this time that Andre Green said, "Thank you, Jesus," ended an award-winning essay about the violence and poverty in her city with the words, "Put down the guns and pick up the babies. And that's exactly what flashed before Andre Green's eyes when he said those words, "Thank you, Jesus." He wanted to put down the guns and pick up the babies. That's what happiness means. A child is a chance, a potential turning point. A child is something to live for, to strive for. As Giovanni told us, it's like a drug you've got to have. Now again, what is the response? What happens after happiness? Men make valiant efforts to get it together with the baby's mother for the sake of the baby. And remarkably, and we know this from survey data, 80% succeed, at least for the time. When a baby comes into the world, 80% of the time his or her parents are together, even though they may be unmarried. But pregnancies in these troubled urban environments are not the mark of commitment. They are not the symbol of a bond. They are the impetus of that bond. It is all about the baby. Bear, a young white man living in West Kensington's girlfriend, Amber, told us, "I see the way he looks at his son. I wish he would look at me that way sometimes." This weak bond, the lack of glue beyond the baby, and by the way, even the kin are opposed. Plus, the pervasive mistrust, as one man said to us, if men don't do, women don't love. Plus, the impossibly high standards for marriage, where the Miss America they want renders the woman they've got as plain Jane. These are why men can't ultimately turn their lives around, why they can't give up the stupid shit that will blow their relationships apart. But the dream spawned by the news of the pregnancy isn't dead yet. Instead, men attempt to persevere, but on decidedly different terms than the old package deal would dictate. They largely reject Ward Cleaver, whose job is to win bread, render discipline, and serve as a moral guide. Sure, they say, you can't leave everything up to the mother, but really, breadwinning is a mother's job. As long as you do the best you can, that's where the title of the book comes from, after meeting your own needs. And by the way, that's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. With what is left over, you're okay, even if it's 50 cents. Sure, you've got to offer some moral guidance. But given your own past, the most you can generally offer is a silk purse made from the sow's ear of your own painful past experiences. The authority you draw on is from the cautionary tale of your own life. Don't take that path. I've been there, I know. Meanwhile, they've elevated, even glorified the softer side of fatherhood. That new model of fatherhood they've adopted with a vengeance from middle-class men. I'm not a paycheck. I'm a dad. I want to be there. I want the Sesame Street mornings. I want to observe the milestones, the first words and the first step. I want the whole fatherhood experience. For these men, a good dad is one who shows love, who keeps the lines of communication open, who spends quality time. In short, these fathers are their children's, or seeking to be their children's, best friends. Wait a minute. What does this sound like? Are these men trying to be moms? Sort of. So just as they flee the Ward Cleaver-style breadwinner role, they're attempting a bold incursion into aspects of parenting reserved for mom. Fatherhood is not a status for these men. It is a role, and the father thirst is remarkably strong. Now, there's two attitudes you can take toward the story I've told so far. One is that this is just a poor man's version of Disneyland Dad. He gets to have all the fun while leaving all of the hard jobs to mom, who must bring home the bacon, fry it up in the pan, and do everything else. But a more sympathetic interpretation is that these men may have settled upon a form of fatherhood they can actually afford. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And now Dan Hatcher.
Thanks. I just want to echo the thanks to the organizers and to Hannah for the wonderful spark. My paper is tentatively titled Forgotten Fathers, and I had lots and lots and lots of statistics. Many of them have already been discussed. I'm going to scrap all, but one that I'd love to throw out is sort of a backdrop that in our country, there's about $105 billion total owed in child support right now. Half of that is owed to the government, not to children, right? Through policies that I'm still surprised that most people don't know in our country, that something called child support, so much of it, half, is not owed to children. Poor mothers are forced to sue poor fathers when they apply for public assistance, be it welfare under the TANF program, often food stamps, Medicaid, in Maryland, even child care assistance. They're forced to name the fathers, they're forced to submit to DNA testing, and then they're forced to sue them time and time again coming in to court. Many of these are the families that have been termed fragile families, part of multiple studies, and this process of the pursuit of government-owed debt is tearing the families apart. So that's a backdrop. Then I want to talk about a client of mine who's become a friend over the years, who I've worked with now for years. He grew up in the foster care system in Baltimore City with him. If anybody knows the Baltimore City foster care system, it's a broken system. The schools are broken. Much of the city is broken. Don't tell our mayor that. He hasn't done well. He moved from place to place, never had a family for more than a year, never had a placement for more than a year. He never finished high school. He's currently unemployed. He has a criminal record. He has no health care, and he's a father. He has a 2-year-old son who he's incredibly proud of. I was talking to him soon after his son was born. Soon after the birth, the mother of the child had to, out of necessity, apply for public assistance, right? So this starts the child support realm happening. As soon as she applied, she was forced to name him and sue him for child support that would then be owed to the state of Maryland to pay back the cost of foster care. Actually, part of it is owed to the federal government too, but I won't get into complications. So she was forced to. He lived with her for a significant amount of this time. They moved in together, and I talked to him about this, and he was hopeful of the relationship. During this time where they're living together, child support is accruing against him in the name of the child that he's now living with and trying to support as best he can. He is now several $1,000s in arrearages. If he ever gets a job, his wages will be garnished at 65% net. He has a criminal record, which I've already mentioned, is blocking his employment possibilities. Also, he will always have no chances of ever having any decent credit history because of all of this. He feels the world is against him. And I was talking to him recently. We had lunch, and we talked a little bit about how he could be the parent that he never had, and he likes this idea. And he's had a spark briefly that I could see, but it seemed like it was gone as soon as it was there. We started to talk, and he started to get into mode of again talking about how the world is against him. And I agree with him in a significant part. And I think the hardest part to me is as he was walking away, I'm not sure if I can help him. And he has a lawyer that's been helping him for years. So he is an example of a poor father that I hope we all remember when we talk about the end of men. For the question of the end of men is not at all theoretical. To me, for many, many poor fathers, the question is whether they will ever have a chance to come back. These fathers are plugged into system equations, right? Be it foster care, child support, paternity, housing, education, the criminal justice system. And they're treated as monolithic, uniform lumps of people that are all same, right? This is essentialism. All treated the same, even though they are continuing variations, right? And anybody knows a little bit of math, I know just a little bit, that if you treat a variable right, as a constant factor, the math is always going to be wrong, and that's what's happening to these poor fathers. And it's not just in one system. Each system this is happening, and then each system is haphazardly interacting with each other, further causing the skew. So when I was a first year in law school, I was one of these students who fell into the trap of not being able to see the forest from the trees very well. I was so focused on the minutiae of my studies that I often had a difficult time pulling back and seeing the big picture. I sometimes find that same thing happening to me when I'm in my research or in my advocacy, that I can get so focused through my own lens that it's awfully easy to miss stuff that's happening in the blurred periphery. And I think for the poor, for poor fathers and poor mothers and poor children, it's in that periphery where so much is happening and causing harm, where the systems are interacting and not interacting well. So I hope for an increased focus on the need for anti-essentialism in all discussions regarding the poor and poor fathers in particular. There's been increasing discussion of anti-essentialism theory and feminist scholarship and critical race theory, moving into discussions of masculinities, as has already been mentioned, including some wonderful scholarship by Nancy Dowd. And I also plead, I guess this is maybe sort of a touchy-feely plea, that I hope we can all work together, because I think many of these policies and discussions can polarize advocates and scholars, and I think that has the risk of to do serious harm to the poor, as are policies that are polarizing the poor. In the late 70s, a term came out called the feminization of poverty construct. Right, so this was Diana Pierce, who's given credibility, given recognition for coining the term. And it was a phrase that is really sort of the flip side, if you think about it, of the end of men and the rise of women. And the phrase really took off. Unfortunately, in my view, it was at that time, moving into the 80s and 90s, co-opted, at least in part, by the conservative anti-welfare push, right? And the labeling of welfare mothers as welfare queens and the absent fathers as deadbeat dads. And through that process led to an essentialist response to anti-essentialist problems, that poverty affects women more than men, and that the answer was not new and nuanced programs, but to simply go after the deadbeat dads and go after them hard. This core belief structure adds to the view of poor fathers as the unworthy poor, and is felt in all other systems impacting the fathers and families, and affects the children growing up with this view. These are fathers who started out, and under many of whom will still remember, some were directly impacted by old welfare rules that literally banned fathers from the households, right? The old man in the house rules that you couldn't get welfare assistance if there was a dad in the house, right? So engendered in the belief structure of poor mothers, of poor fathers of society, was that men were not welcome. So these fathers were banned from the households and then blamed for being absent. And this mindset is still very much prevalent today. And our modern-day child support policies, which I call modern-day bastardy acts. I don't really have enough time to get into it, but so I hope that these policies that I think are polarizing the poor, forcing poor mothers and poor fathers into opposing courtroom tables against each other, rather than allowing them the opportunity to work together when it's appropriate, or causing harm, and need to stop. And I hope that all of us can work together to start work together.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to come. Would you shut me? Yes. Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks for your patience. And I know it's a long panel, but it's like one of my favorite topics. So anyway, so earlier today there was a slide that Serena Mayeri had up that at the bottom of one of the slides was a July 15th, 2012 New York Times headline, 2 classes divided by I do. explaining the divide in the subcaption, marriage for richer, single mother, no, I'm sorry, marriage for richer, single motherhood for poorer. And this is kind of the jump-off point for my remarks today, and I can only do a little bit of what I'll eventually do in the published symposium, which is the other marriage equality problem. And the lengthy story that got quite a bit of attention, including criticism, like quit beating up on single mothers, contrasted the lives of two friendly white women from modest Midwestern backgrounds who left for college with conventional hopes of marriage, motherhood, and career. However, Jessica, the single mother, who left college after becoming pregnant and cohabited with, but did not marry, her children's now absent father, bears alone the challenges and responsibilities of raising 3 children. Jessica's an employee of the married mother, Chris Faulkner, mother of 2, who did standard things in standard order: high school, college, marriage, and children. Jason DeParle asserts that what most separates these 2 women is not things like the impact of globalization on their wages, but a 6-foot 8-inch man named Kevin, Chris's husband. DeParle uses this portrait of 2 women's lives to sound a cautionary note about family inequality, hearkening back to sociologist Sarah McClanahan's warning about how family structure consigns children to diverging destinies. No doubt what warranted the spot on the front page of the Sunday New York Times is the news that it's white women with less than a 4-year college degree who account for the greatest increase in non-marital births and single-parent households. This article caught my eye not only because its author, Jason DeParle, penned so many significant news stories back in the 90s during the protracted congressional debates over welfare reform nearly 2 days ago, and continues to cover trends concerning poverty issues in America, including his book, American Dream. It also took me back to those very debates and the warning sent out by Charles Murray in his provocative Wall Street Journal essay, The Coming White Underclass. Indeed, DeParle's article eventually mentions Murray's newest book, Coming Apart, The Story of White America. Now, this news story identifies what we might call the other marriage equality problem. And by other, I mean I've spent a lot of time, like some of you have, on issues about marriage equality for gay men and lesbians, right? Marriage equality. But there's other marriage equality issues, including this class divide concerning marriage. But this news story about growing family inequality and the marriage divide caught my attention because it also contrasts sharply with another type of media story about the future of marriage. And one thing I'm hoping this conference will help me with is trying to make sense of these different type of stories that circulate. In January 2012, several months earlier, a vivacious and smiling woman graced the cover of Boston Magazine in the story Single by Choice. The caption reads, "This is Terry. She's successful, happy, and at 38, just fine with never getting married, ever." The take-home message of this story is that more Americans than ever before are saying, "I don't," that singles now make up nearly half the adult population of the country, and that new research suggests they're happier, more social, more active in the community than many of their wedded counterparts. And the message to readers, friends, family, and others should get off their back. The magazine story profiles several happy women leading full and fun lives, including an older woman who goes on knitting trips around the world. One premise of this story is not everyone aspires to marry, yet cultural messages that happiness and success come through our partnerships leave us unequipped to deal with people who remain single by choice. So I was very struck by these contrasting stories about marriage and wanted to use them as kind of a lens through which to discuss what I consider the other marriage problem and claims about the end of men. And without in any way equating these 2 books, and I want to say this emphatically, without in any way equating these 2 books, I do believe that HannaRosin's book and Charles Murray's book are interesting foils for each other to talk about what's happening to marriage. Because both talk about two tracks for family life. In Murray's case, it's the super zip codes and the new upper class on one hand, and then Fishtown kind of falling apart on the other. And I think you actually have a reference to Fishtown in your paper. So that's kind of one story about marriage inequality. And then there's this other story about marriage is not even that important to certain lifestyles. And the single by choice story, let me just back up. I care about that first story, the marriage divide and marriage inequality, because if we care about the relationship between the family and the polity, and the role of civil society in generating and sustaining the American experiment in ordered liberty, warnings about growing family inequality and what McClain and some of her colleagues talk about, the intergenerational transmission or reproduction of inequality to children, warrant attention. And elsewhere, I've written about the place of families in social reproduction, nurturing children, preparing them for capable and responsible lives as good persons and good citizens. And I express this in terms of the shared responsibility of family, government, and other parts of civil society, aside from family, to foster, this is all my jargon, sorry, to foster the capacity for personal and democratic self-government. And this is a formative project. Jim Fleming and I argue in a new book that is part of kind of ordered liberty. And it entails children, too, who are both, as Vivian Hamilton put it, immature citizens as well as future citizens. At the same time, the who needs marriage story poses a different challenge about the place of marriage. Who says that a stable, well-ordered society needs most people to marry? What if the unmarried, the single by choice, can and do contribute to civil society, to civic life, and the like? And what if those affluent and successful Americans who remain single by choice remain childless? If not only marriage but parenthood are not part of the life plan for more and more of the most successful, then what happens to the literal reproduction on which society depends, to say nothing of the social reproduction of the virtues, traits, and of character that support self-government in a constitutional democracy? Now, the big issue here is McClanahan warned in her lecture back in 2004 that there's somehow this notion that college-educated women are increasingly rejecting marriage and rejecting children. But she said that's not actually what's happening. So what you get is a kind of parenthood-marriage divide where the question is, are women becoming parents in the context of marriage, or are they becoming parents outside of the context of marriage, and how does that break down along class lines? Now, for me, as not being a sociologist, it can be very confusing sometimes because, you know, when I started writing about some of these issues, there was Murphy Brown, right? And this whole thing about Murphy Brown and Charles Murray warning, most single mothers aren't Murphy Brown. They're poor white women or poor black women or what have you. And we all know that there are a larger number of women who use reproductive technology, who are lesbian co-moms, who are having children in all sorts of different ways other than in a male-female marital family. And we don't think of them as members of the struggling, working poor or middle class. And yet we have all these sociologists warning us about diverging destinies, reproduction of inequality, and the like. So personally, as a law professor, not a sociologist, a demographer, I find some of this kind of hard to figure out. And I know June and Naomi could straighten me out in about 10 minutes, and maybe they will. But anyway, but when you read Rosin's books, what's so interesting is in her chapter about hookup culture, and then in her chapter about these superachieving women, these are women who avoid marriage and children because they see them as kind of getting in their way. They're just like getting them off track and getting in their way, okay? And these are women who sort of avoid marriage as well as sometimes parenthood because they just see it as kind of, you know, in their way. What are these men really going to do but get in their way? At the same time, lower down on the class divide, you see women, as my daughter reported to me from the book talk she went to, saying, why do I want him in the house? It's just one more granola bar that I and my daughter can't have. You know, like if I have a man in the house who's not contributing anything, and Kathy's written about this extensively, why do I need him? So that's not a woman who's necessarily rejecting reproduction, but she's rejecting having the man in the household. So there's all sorts of things swirling around in this big mess, and it's hard to sort out what exactly is the marriage equality problem. And in my 3 minutes that are left, what I'd like to talk about is another aspect of the marriage equality problem, and this was brought home most vividly to me in Hannah's New York Times Magazine piece, Who Wears the Pants in the New Economy? And what I want to focus on particularly there, skipping over most of this, is what's so amazing in that story is the photographs in this story. The photographs show women literally propping up their men. I don't know if she had any control in how they did these photographs, but basically, you know, they're solidly middle class people who experienced a reversal of fortune when their husbands lost work in the recession, and the women are sort of, you know, have their arm around the men. He's kind of standing like this, and she's kind of like this. And it's like they're literally trying to prop these men up in this fragile new world. And they're trying to make sense of their Christian training that says men are the head of the household. And how do they interpret that in this new economy where the women are bringing in the earnings? How do they interpret what it means that it's biblically ordained that the man is the leader and that the woman should be submissive? Okay, so that to me as a feminist scholar, it's really interesting to see how these gender dynamics are at play. Now, Hannah also gives us an extremely troubling picture lower down the class line. We've already talked about this couple once, Troy and Shannon. The woman who works at Walmart and also is an exotic dancer, and he says, ain't a man, whatever the expression is he keeps saying, ain't a man, and retaliates by her coming home late by choking her until she passes out and buying her a choker to cover the bruise, right? And he likes to think of their relationship as a Jerry Springer type of relationship, and yet he's somehow stuck in the past. He can't move forward, and so forth and so on. But even the men who are in the so-called seesaw marriages that Hannah describes sometimes seem to be struggling with the new power, the power that the women have, particularly when the women earn more or are seemingly more successful than the men are. And there's a portrait she paints of this couple. If I can just find it, it's Sarah and Stephen and their son Xavier. And it doesn't seem like Stephen does a whole lot. Sarah does an awful lot. And at the end, Xavier kind of pees on the wall three times. And Stephen ineffectively changes his diaper. And Stephen philosophizes, all boys do is pee on things. Nothing good ever comes from being a man. Women bring good things into the world. If I live longer if I have a wife, I have a better, healthier life. He had wished for a little Anne of Green Gables. He wanted a little girl. So this is the seesaw marriage, and even there's all this kind of ambivalence about what the sexes are doing and what it means to be a man and so forth and so on. So I'm going to stop there because I want to set a good example for everyone who else did. And now we're going to open it up to discussion. Okay, I know it's been a crazy schedule with never enough time to talk, so let's just see who has, do you have your hand up?
I do.
Okay, why don't you start then?
Sure, and this is for, I guess, Kathy or Dan. I have a question about middle class expectations, because Kathy, this comes up in both of your books, like how much they're affecting the poor. Why, is that a new thing? Is that because of television? Like, why is it that there's suddenly this idea that you have to be a father or a mother in a certain way, and in the way that you know, that sort of upper class people are fathers or mothers? And it seems to me like really sort of a toxic thing, because it creates a totally impossible standard for, I guess in your mother's book it was the standard of marriage, and in this book it's the standard of fatherhood. But I can't tell if it's a good or totally horrible thing.
Well, we argue, and this is the last chapter of the book, so we're being wildly speculative, right? You can't prove this historical stories. That just as men used to really adhere to this old-fashioned package deal where the sort of price of entry into the family was breadwinning. But we argue that just as the rug was sort of pulled out from under them in the economy. This feminism sort of provoked this response from men called the new father. And whereas middle-class men, as several speakers today have said, are kind of pairing the new father with the old father. They're not rejecting wholesale breadwinning, but they're kind of incorporating more time with the kids in addition to their other responsibilities. Poor men have really sort of rejected or even run away from the more traditional roles, but kind of gone whole hog for this new father image. So we kind of argue that in some ways, the new father rescued men, but very quickly, it turns out that men's bold incursion into, the mother's domain and sort of trading new father for old father doesn't work out very well in the short run. This is for a couple of reasons. First, they still can't stop doing the stupid shit, so their scorecard quickly gets more weighted toward failures and successes. Second, there's a lot of trauma in the family of origin, so having this psychological muscle to stay involved when your ex-partner says, hey, Charlie, it's your damn dad on the phone, and while you're saying, hey, I'm not just a paycheck, your ex-partner is still asking you, what have you done for me lately? Well, rubbing the imagined missing lucre between her thumb and index fingers. So he oftentimes doesn't succeed in the long run, but through serial fathering, which is very, very common at the bottom and really distinctive in the United States in its frequency, he can claim a new chance to father over and over again. And Lerman and Sorensen's analysis of NLY show that 70% of these men are actively, weekly fathering at least one of their non-marital children at any given time, but rarely all of them.
I'll just add.
Use a mic. You have to wait for the mic, okay?
I'll just add quickly. My own experience is the clients I'm representing. I have a little bit of a skewed view because by the time I'm representing the clients, that are already in a really, really, really hard place, and the vast majority of the folks I've worked with have pretty much given up. That's really hard. Often, as an advocate for someone, some have done well, but most haven't. Most won't. And most have never experienced middle class, and I don't know if they really have any hopes to get there because I don't think they think it's a possibility. Sorry to sound jaded.
Great. Thanks for the excellent panel. I'm Philip Cohen. By the way, I have the great privilege of getting to go last at the end of this conference. So I get to go home tonight and revise everything home to the hotel. I just wanted to say something about Linda, your confusion over trying to characterize the demography. That's very reasonable, and it also fits with the confusion over. It fits with the problem that we get when we, meaning not me but other people, try to compress complicated stories into single messages like the end of men. And the truth is that there's a proliferation of scripts for how to organize and operate family life. This is a feature of our era. There's not one pattern that fits across social class or across race or so on. It's interesting that you kept saying single by choice. The book about this is called Single by Chance, Mothers by Choice, right? That's a different story. The people who are single by chance, not because they want to be single.
I think she's coming to dinner. No, she's not. Somebody else is.
Anyway.
No, I know that book.
Right,
Yes.
right. But that's a different pattern, okay? But anytime you try to take one of these patterns out and say, this is why X is the new Y and what it means for all of us, you tend to do violence to the facts. Which is not to say, and I definitely am not, definitely don't think we need to throw up our hands and say all statistics you can say anything with statistics and everything is meaningless and there is no narrative. In fact, it actually makes it more important to pay attention to the big picture, such as men rule the economy and dominate at all levels, and that's relatively unthreatened in any substantial way. Like, I think we have to see that in the big picture, but we also can look and not try to to tell too much of an overarching story when the facts aren't there. Just a comment.
I'm sorry, who, right behind you then, sure. Oh, okay. And then you next.
So I think this question primarily directed at Kathy or anyone else who has a perspective. One of the things I was very struck with when you were talking was thinking about the dominant narrative around unmarried single moms and the young teen moms in the 60s, the 70s, and the trajectory that was the beginning of the end and destroying their lives. And then there were a couple of people who really wrote about looking at it from a very different perspective, and that for some young women at the, quote, bottom, actually having a child young galvanized them to make different sets of choices that they would have in order to really provide a different life for their child. And I teach at UMass Boston. I actually see that dynamic at play for a significant number of my students who never thought they'd end up in college and ended up with a baby, and suddenly that became a galvanizing moment in their lives, and sort of a very different idea than that, sending them on a downward spiral. And I wonder, as you were talking about these men in this new model of fatherhood, whether, and it means a second chance, but whether there's some transformative shift for them also in their lives, not just in relation to their child, but somehow reconstructing what life means for them in terms of school, in terms of jobs, in that same sense.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what they envision when they feel this happiness. You know, it's like, wow, I could maybe make it. I've got something to live for now. Why it doesn't work out that way, usually, sometimes it does, is kind of the subject of the book. I just want to make one little statement, however, as a corrective to this literature you're talking about. There are no single mothers anymore. We used to think that the counterfactual to a married two-parent family, you know the story already, right, was a stable single mother. The Fragile Family Study shows that only 4% of all mothers who give birth outside of marriage are stably single in the first 5 years of their kids' lives. So really the new counterfactual now is highly, churning partnerships and highly complex families with half-sibs along the way. And this pattern is historically unique in the United States, and it is also unique among rich nations. We don't know what this means for kids yet, but it's it's an important new sort of fact that there's a great little PowerPoint on the Fragile Families website. You can just look under my name. I did it with Laura Tack and Sarah McClanahan, but it really shows you how complex these families are. So stable single mothers, we don't even know what as far as we can tell, they may be just fine for kids. But this family complexity that's really, in some ways the book I wrote with Tim Nelson, Doing the Best I Can, is trying to tell the story that underlies this partner churning that leads to these highly complex families that seem new, and at least we didn't know they were there before, even if they're not that new.
Nancy.
I'm delighted to hear all this conversation about fathers and fatherhood. So this is a question for Kathy and Dan, but really for everybody on the panel. I'm curious, as you know, the federal policy in this area is the responsible fatherhood, get everybody married, that's going to be the cure for low-income families, which I think most scholars say that's ridiculous. And it's been spectacularly unsuccessful. Okay, move closer? Okay. Should I start over again? All right. Here's the question, then. I'll forget the prelude. Is if you could, I wonder if any or all of you want to comment on what would you choose as a next first step in a policy or practice to support more nurture by fathers?
What was the last part? To support
More
what?
nurture.
More nurture. Yeah.
Whether it's at the low income, middle income, or high income.
Well, I'll just say just a little thing here. I mean, paradoxically, what we actually would do well to have is actually more nurture or more resources provided by the state to actually ease some of the pressure that's on families. Because one of the problems that we have is that there's so many pressures that it's a hard deal to work out and to sustain to keep the family together. And there are lots of initiatives that could actually ease the pressure on families so that then it would become more likely that families could stay together.
I think child support should be a choice that belongs to the custodial parent. It's usually she, not always, but the custodial parent is in the best position to decide whether or not to pursue the absent parent. For the poor, the choice is taken away, and I think that's a pretty pathetic policy. And then I think that two-parent benefits should be real. I don't think they should be forced, so I have concerns with, you mentioned, of the federal marriage promotion effort, but I think for many families, supporting the potential for whether it be marriage or two-parent parenting, or at least collaboration, I think to allow those policies, and because a lot of advocates don't even realize that two-parent benefits are available for welfare assistance still, and when you can get those benefits, it's much, much, much more difficult. Same thing with housing policy. Just about any public benefit you think of, it's incredibly difficult to get it if you're a two-parent family.
Let me just say that the answer to that question, right, is sort of like everything else we've been talking about today. So it's everything from the Swedish model, albeit with economic equality and economic parity. Hannah was talking about the Swedish model. We've also been talking about economic equality and parity. It's John Williams' work on the workplace. It's deconstructing masculinity. I'm not sure there's one thing.
Actually, but let me add, the Kansas School of Economics, there is such a thing, got a spread in Playboy this summer as a heterodox economics department that otherwise gets no attention because it doesn't use enough equations. But they have a set of policies that talk about what full employment would really look like, including the government as the employer of the last resort, and the idea that jobs do, in general, have good effects wherever they come from.
We're a little over, but I can't tell if there's. Okay, why don't we take one more then?
Well, I wanted to thank Rick for your point about kind of that, both the absence and the presence of the African American experience in this larger history. I think that's a really profound statement. And I also wanted to ask you something more specifically about one of the comments you made about the relationship between education. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I'm having a hard time because of the echo.
I think if you hold it closer.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you, can you hear me now? Okay. About one of the connections that you were drawing between class, education, and marriage within the African American community. And I'm wondering when class and education actually converge in this sense, because I think about my grandparents who married in the 30s, and she ended up getting her master's in education, and my grandfather was a tradesman. And I don't think that relationship, that kind of relationship, was atypical within the African American community. So that is to say that, African American women becoming teachers, going and at least getting a bachelor's degree, and perhaps even a master's degree, pretty much marrying men who were skilled laborers, but still both of those sort of steady incomes allowed them to enter into the middle class, or at least the lower middle class. So when do you begin to see those two things diverge in terms of level of education and class, and how that's shaping marriage and marriage, marriage within the African American community?
That's a great issue. I hope I understand this correctly. So why would we think there would be just to rephrase it, why would we think it would be an issue to have spouses of different educational statuses now when it wasn't an issue 50 years ago, right? And it was really common, and there were lots of relationships. And frankly, my parents, my father didn't graduate. Well, he graduated from high school. There's a dispute about that, but my mother did and attended some college, so we had a similar situation. And I think there are a few things that have changed, and I'm not saying that relationships can't work across class boundaries or with income gaps. My motto has always been love who you can and be happy, and one should not be, create boundaries where they need not exist. But it's also the case that sometimes education and income are associated with other differences that one will bring to a relationship. And we're in a society where people don't like to talk about class, but there are real differences there. If you look at for black men, the opportunities on the trades and so forth, opportunities were so great in the 40s, 50s, 60s that you had lots of people who were, just very smart and very, with the mentality of a very upwardly mobile mentality, who were working in areas that didn't require a college education. Now, those same people actually would probably go to college. So there's been a shift, if this makes sense, in that when how people are selected into the trades versus going to college. So that's the part of the story. Another part of the story, and I'll just try to be brief, is that the understandings of marriage have changed a lot too. Again, my father, even who's deceased, he would tell my sisters. My father was born in 1913, and when my sisters would bring home these guys, his basic question was, does he drink? Does he work? And the correct answer is no to the first one, yes to the second one, right? And has he been violent? And he had a really short list of questions that, in his mind, indicated whether someone was a good husband. And we would always joke about this because, of course, my sisters wanted a lot more out of a husband than what my father thought was sufficient. But that's about how things have changed over time, right? So there might have been differences between couples that wouldn't have been a problem in 1950, but in 2000, that's a problem because people have different expectations for fulfillment and compatibility and conversation and all this sort of stuff. And I think that's some of what we see. Again, you see it among all groups, but it's most extreme among African Americans, and that's because we have a really tragic and saddening situation with black men where we have just these untold numbers of black men who are not faring as well as they should be. And black women are doing a lot better, and that creates problems all up and down the socioeconomic spectrum.
So I just wanted to say 45 seconds on that because as just a plug for Kathy Edin's forthcoming book, it's a really interesting sentiment reported in the chapter she gave us that the men are holding out for a soulmate. The woman they're with kind of by happenstance because it's the mother of the baby is not the right woman. They're really waiting for their soulmate. Now, I've been following this marriage issue for some time, and I remember when the National Marriage Project ridiculed the fact that so many young women said what they look for in a partner is not so much a breadwinner as a companion, and they want a soulmate. So we're kind of seeing this soulmate ideal across the sort of class lines, and it's very interesting. But what I'd like to propose we do is there's a reception in Barristers Hall, which is just into the Law Tower with wine, beer, food, whatever, books for sale, authors to talk to, speakers to talk to, discussions to be had. So conclude today. I hope to see some of you tomorrow at 9:30, and please join us at Barristers for a reception. Thank you.